Well, I came in 1969, so it's 52 years now. I moved in July or August of 69. I came up here from Vanderbilt in Nashville, where I had an almost complete doctorate, a dissertation still underway. So my first year here was as an instructor with a one-year contract. Wasn't sure I'd get to stay because they told me I had to finish my dissertation. Fortunately for me, unfortunately for the town, May of 70, May the 12th, we closed the university because of the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. I was teaching then, of course, and would have gone through about early June, and then I was going to teach summer school. But when all that happened, I got to finish my dissertation. So that was one good thing personally that came of that. And I've been here ever since. I got a assistant professor position by virtue of finishing my dissertation. I spent 10 years as sort of a pure academic. I worked my way up through the ranks, and I was president of the faculty senate, so I always was involved with other things besides sort of the pure academics.
Is that around the time that Kevin would have been a student?
It was a little, he may still have been here. It was 75, 76.
Okay.
And then I got a chance to be associate dean of the graduate school, which I did, and then I became acting dean of the graduate school because the president left, got fired, and John Guyon, who was dean and my boss, got asked to be acting president, so he made me acting dean. I did that for almost 5 years, and then went back to political science, and within less than a year I was associate dean of liberal arts. I did that for 1 year and became dean. I was dean of liberal arts for 12 years. I was then provost and vice chancellor for academic affairs for 2.5 years, was asked to be interim chancellor. So for 25 months I was interim chancellor. So at that point I had done it all, took retirement. Then in January of 2001 I became a visiting professor and staff member at the Institute. I had helped co-found the Institute as Dean of Liberal Arts, so I knew the Institute and knew Paul well, and seemed like a good fit. Paul had been a good friend. I'd been a strong supporter of his, and so he and Mike Lawrence asked me to come back because at that point I'd moved to Little Rock and became a visiting professor at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock. But I came back in order to take that job and been here ever since.
I tell you what I love about that particular component of the story, John, is that it proves that you're never too graduated in life for Carbondale to not just pull you right back in.
That's true. That's exactly what happened.
And we hope you get pulled into this, the 78th episode of the WTF Carbondale podcast.
Well, I'll have to figure out how to do that.
And where we talk to interesting people about their interesting lives and tie it all back to this little place we call home, Carbondale, Illinois, and a very special person who has called this place home for many years. So you said
50 years.
Over 50 years. So what, I mean, was there any particular push out of the door at Vanderbilt that prompted you to here? Or was it just kind of a activity was accessible and this is just where you came? I know you gave kind of a little primer of that off the top of the show.
Well, my leaving Vanderbilt and coming here was push-pull. Number one, I had a very pregnant wife who had been teaching school in Nashville. She said, "It's your turn to get a job." So you need to get a job even though your dissertation's not done. And I had some thoughts about staying one more year because I could have finished and taken another class or two. But anyway, we needed to survive, and so I went on the job market and got interviewed at the Southern Political Science Association meeting by a delegation from SIU.
Uh-huh.
That led to an invitation in January of '69 to come up here and go through the full drill for getting interviewed, and that then led to the job. And it was a good place. I thought interesting place. It was just huge at that time.
Yeah.
People couldn't find places to live. We couldn't get enough classes open for them. The classes were overflowing, and I thought, wow, this is a dynamic, interesting place. And I had been in a small school by comparison. Vanderbilt at that time was about 5,000 undergraduates and 5,000 graduates. And private schools are very different. So I thought, okay, megaversity, I'll go see how that is.
Yeah.
And it turned out. Again, I could have stayed 1 year and been gone, but they offered me a permanent at that point, and so I stayed.
It's almost just like a roll of the dice. Some folks catch it, and some folks,
Yeah.
kind of jump up and move on.
Yeah, and I didn't come here with an ambition to move on, but I didn't expect to stay all that long. I figured 4 or 5 years and maybe make tenure here, assistant professor to associate. But I first thought I would probably do that, and I looked at things that came my way at various times, particularly as an administrator. But what I was currently doing or about to do at SIU was always better than what I was looking at, so we stayed.
How has it kind of changed over the years, right? And this is something that just hearing you kind of talk through the different roles that sparked my interest is just what it looked like. You used the phrase, kind of connected with the delegation before coming here to interview.
Yeah.
Right. And what a process looked like that period, how the process has evolved through the decades, and how it's looked at different times and bringing people on and people moving around university systems throughout the country, and kind of where we're at now and how much different even probably in the last year and a half things have changed versus what we were living in before even the pandemic.
Well, in sort of gross anatomy, I would say SIU then was a teenager kind of place, even though at that point we were 100 years old. We had our 100th in 1969 when we had our 100th anniversary. But as a full-blown, complete, comprehensive institution with major graduate and research commitments, we were young at that game and had been growing by leaps and bounds. We couldn't keep up with the demand, and it was just a very dynamic place with lots of new and young people coming in and lots of excitement about that growth and building really a major university where we had been up until recently before that primarily a teacher's college with ag and liberal arts and education being sort of the center of that. Since then, we have totally matured. We've become what we are today, which is a very significant and fairly mature university, although we have, of course, our numbers have shrunk, and we've had to readjust to that. And I think we're in a maturity that is maybe middle age or midlife crisis from time to time, and we've had to survive several midlife crises along the way. So it's been interesting to see that evolution of SIU, and as we go, so goes the town in many ways.
Yeah.
It was a very dynamic place then, but frankly, downtown was one of the ugliest places I'd ever seen then. I was in the Army and did my basic at Fort Hood, Texas, and Killeen, Texas is a notorious Army town full of beer joints and other places that take care of the needs of servicemen, mostly then. And I came up through here and drove up the Strip, and I thought, man, this looks like Killeen, Texas. I don't know if I can live here or not. But the university was really had some beautiful areas even then, much more attractive. And the city has come a long way, particularly on the Southern Illinois Avenue development, and all of that has changed almost all for the better, because it really was pretty trashy.
Yeah.
Downtown, there were nice parts, but downtown wasn't among them. So I've watched Carbondale change as we've changed, and you know, when we get a cold at SIU, Carbondale gets pneumonia sometimes, and it's been hard on Carbondale. But the university, I think, and the city have way better relationships now than I mentioned the demonstrations and the disruptions of May of 1970. The city and the area hated those. There was a major businessman that said we ought to get a tank and drive it up Southern Illinois Avenue and shoot them all. It was that bad. The relationships on Town and Gown were really bad in those days in lots of ways.
Was it simply because people from the town saw the school simply as the reason why people existed in place who had a different way of acting or thinking than they may have?
Yeah, it was really a typical sort of rural area reaction to an awful lot of hippies and yippies and everything you could think of. And you and your beard today would have been tame in those days. I mean, good grief, some of the people chose to demonstrate their political and anti-war sentiments in very evident ways. So that irritated the town, some of them, and certainly the area further out of Carbondale you got, the more condemnation there was of those days. And we were full of African Americans from Chicago and St. Louis. We had the second highest percentage of African American students of any non-HCBU in the country, next only to Wayne State in downtown Detroit. We had kids from all over. We had 100 different countries on campus, and there is cultural clash there. I think that's gotten a lot better, and it's become much more accepting on both sides, but certainly I think the city and the area had to get used to the diversity of SIU.
And I will come back to that because I think just having the insight of seeing the town be and then maintain being unlike any or most rural areas in the United States, right? Not just the region, but really around the country. But before I get there, just to kind of pave the way to there, because I'm interested in this too, is why politics for John Jackson? Was it something that you just always had an interest in, or did you stumble into it, or what drew you this direction?
Well, I sort of inherited it. My dad was a farmer, cotton farm in deep South Arkansas in the 40s. If you've ever read John Grisham's A Painted House, he and his family left an East Arkansas cotton farm in order to move to town in order to survive. My folks did the same thing. Farming cotton in South Arkansas in the 40s was a terrible way to make a living. My dad lived on the family farm, but he decided to move to town, became a plumber, and after being a plumber for a few years, he became the superintendent of the water, sewer, streets departments, all of which consisted of him and one other guy because it was a town of less than 1,500.
Yeah.
But he did it all. He was also volunteer fire department assistant chief, and I saw all of that up close and personal. I joined him in digging ditches and laying pipeline and making water and sewer taps and all of that in the summers when I got old enough to do so. So my first job was 75 cents an hour working in the sewer system. You can't get much more down to earth than helping throw the hard matter out of the drying pit after it had been cured in the hot Arkansas sun, which was one of my first duties. And, literally digging ditches with a shovel and a pick. So everything's been up since then. But, I learned what city government was about, and I took an interest in state government, and from that, national government very early on. And I was delighted when I went off to school and learned that you could actually major in political science. I had no idea at the time.
That's great. Is there just having been hands-on like that, do you look at things like the lead pipe issue throughout this country and just go, there's better policy that could work here, people. This is the core of service delivery, that the greater good is supposed to be served by this, by this form of, government that we live under or in or amongst.
I think we don't teach that fundamental lesson. I said to a class not long ago, we do a great job in this country on teaching the concepts of individual rights and individual freedoms. Everybody gets that real fast. And then they turn into people who don't want to contribute any tiny laws, let's say wearing a mask or social distancing or any of that. I told that class the concept of herd immunity is about as community-oriented, a group-oriented, what it takes to live in an orderly society, and why your freedoms are much expanded by living in that ordered society. Otherwise, you get this social contract theory. You get Hobbes's life in a state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. And it really is. When anarchy comes, you're at nasty, brutish, and short, and the biggest guy with the biggest club or the biggest army is going to run the show. And I had tried to explain all of that to my classes over the years, but I don't think that message takes with a lot of people because there's so many countervailing norms and myths and deep-seated beliefs out there. So right now I'm going to preach a bit here, but my sermonette is right now we've got, 33, 34, 35% that say they're not going to make any contribution to beating COVID. Well, it's going to take a group effort. Already has taken a group effort, but they're not interested. And so they go on and demonstrate and go crazy over, I don't want to wear a mask and I don't want to take a shot.
Yeah.
And so I think we failed on that side of the equation. You have to have both. I teach, first through the 10th Amendment and all those freedoms that are guaranteed by the Constitution, but I also try to teach that there are obligations to the community. And I think to some extent it came from my early days of seeing my dad having to provide safe drinking water. And what it took, we sent samples off to the State Board of Health to make sure he was doing that, and having to provide safe sewer systems. But if you live in a place without safe drinking water and safe sewage systems, as many of my friends who rode the school bus into town lived in those days, you understand that it really takes a communal effort to provide those services. And so that was kind of my early introduction, and I've tried to talk about both sides of that equation.
Well, that's just the purest form of just commitment to this whole system, right? What you individually and as part of a system have contributed overall to the body politic throughout decades of work and service, sometimes at the same time, sometimes separately, right? Work may be work may be service may be service standalone.
Yeah, they overlapped.
Yeah,
certainly.
And I think it's interesting that you kind of tap on the order component as well, and the difference that we see now between what order could and should be, right? The order of society and just the flow of life versus this focus on strict regimentation and the difference between order and regimentation, and how that kind of plays out in everyday life now, where people say, oh, I want order, but what they really say is, I want regimentation, and those are just simply not the same things.
Well, yeah, any concentration on the order and on the law and on keeping the peace and to some extent the status quo can easily merge into authoritarianism and dictatorships. And now all strong men, of course, use the excuses that we got to keep order. And so clearly you can drop off that end of the continuum very easily. And there's some countries in Middle Europe right now struggling with that. Places also like Turkey, for example, could tip over and maybe has already tipped over into authoritarianism. And the Latin American countries have struggled with that for a long time. So, yeah, you can push that too far very rapidly. I don't think we're at that point, but there are certain authoritarian elements that wouldn't mind us tipping over that tipping point.
Yeah. Have you done a reasonable amount of travel throughout the course of anything from study to work, and whether it's as a dean or as part of the institute, or do you usually stay pretty well rooted in space here? How does that?
No, I was always a big proponent of internationalism. That's one thing I appreciated about SIU. I worked briefly between my master's degree and then going back to get a doctorate later. I had a stint in Washington working for Senator J.W. Fulbright. He's of the Fulbright program. And so I had a natural introduction. I knew who he was, got a job with him, went out to Washington, served for a short time on assistant clerk to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee because he was chair at the time. So all of that resonated with me when I got to SIU. I had many opportunities to travel and took advantage of all of them that I could. I represented the university many times to a number of different countries. I helped set up the campus that we had for 10 years in Japan. I got to go to Russia once. I got to go to 2 or 3 places in Europe several times. I got to go to Korea once, to Taiwan twice. And my last long trip for the university was I went to Iraq and to Baghdad in 2008, and it was still a war zone then, but it had begun to start opening up, and one of my PhD students was head of the placement of graduate students for all of Iraq. And they wanted to have a relationship with SIU. So I went to Baghdad and landed at the airport, got on a van and a caravan of vans with a lot of guys with a lot of guns and went downtown Baghdad. So that was my last long trip for the university. And then particularly since I left administration, I've paid for and gone on a fair number of private trips too.
Did you look around when you were driving down Baghdad and go, this looks an awful lot like Colleen, Texas?
Yeah. It looked like a lot of guys with a lot of big guns and a lot of armor and a lot of stuff I recognized. And the van I was on had about 16 administrators from other universities, plus Larry Dietz and I, who was from SIU then. He was vice chancellor for student affairs. And we had a couple of guys with a couple of very large guns on each end of the van.
Did you ever take much interest in the war and force aspect of politics, or was that
war and force?
Yeah, I mean, just in general, the conflict aspect of politics.
That's not my field exactly. That comes under international relations mostly, and I taught that in a cursory fashion when I was teaching things like Intro to American Government. I'd teach a unit on American foreign and defense policy. So as a citizen and as somebody interested, I've read a lot of that, but I didn't teach a lot of it.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. The that's cool. I mean, that's quite the talking through all the opportunities to just go different places and,
Oh yeah,
and
it was
representing.
great. It was a great fringe benefit. The trips were often difficult.
Yeah.
Other than going to Iraq and Baghdad, the toughest trip was going to Russia because
Mm-hmm.
we went just as Glasnost was getting started and just as the government was lightening up and trying to make things different.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when you got out of Moscow, we went to Vladimir, which is about 120 miles out of Moscow.
Mm-hmm.
It was really rough and tough and primitive out there, and a third world country easily.
Mm-hmm. Now I've got a friend who grew up. Part of his childhood spent in Russia. His father was a minister, and just talking about the overall difference in the way folks think in Russia versus here, right? There's been so much talk in recent years of that lineup between people, but the reality is we come from two very different planes of existence. Just in the last 100 years alone.
They're still living with the residue of the czars. They had a dictatorial form of government and culture that acculturated to that, and while they had superficially the trappings of democracy, they had authoritarian leaders, and they still have an authoritarian leader. And so it's tough to build democracy on a foundation that doesn't have some cultural values that really will support it, and making that transition is really tough. That's why we don't do nation building very well with the American military. You can't import that nation building under the gun of the American military, and that's why Afghanistan's impervious to our values, and Russia, all kinds of places like Iraq where we've tried to do that. It doesn't work very well, and the military not trained to do that anyway.
What was your role when you were enlisted?
When I was in the military?
Yeah.
I went through the infantry school. I went through the infantry school basic at Fort Hood, and then I went to Fort Benning, which is also the home of the infantry, and I went through that. And then I got the chance to be in Army intelligence, and heck, I'd been in political science, so that looked good to me, and I figured out I'd really want to be in the infantry if I could get another option, and so I spent the rest of my time in the Army Intelligence Corps.
That's cool. That's cool. I won't ask you too much further than that. Intelligence Corps probably can't talk too much, even years later.
Well, mine was pretty tame stuff, but it was interesting stuff.
That's cool. That's cool. I mean, it's just the way that whole has changed. I look at something like all of the geospatial activity that we have coming out of the Metro East, right? And just most folks pay no mind to it, right? They don't understand where their access to Google Earth comes from, but it's something wild.
Oh yeah, I got to take a tour of NSA, the National Security Agency, one time. And that was an eye opener. They can do some really incredible things there.
Is there any particular door that you've gotten through over the course of your time, whether it's with the Institute or elsewhere, that really just sticks out and kind of to this day kind of blows your mind a little bit? Like, wow, I can't believe I got to go into this place and see this thing.
Well, I did. I did have lots of good experiences, both academic and political leaders meeting us at the airport and taking us to this and that. But going to the Green Zone and going to downtown Baghdad was probably my most unexpected kind of experience. And by then I was too old to fight a firefight, so I was hoping not to have to put any of that to use. But I've had some other really interesting opportunities to negotiate with governors, for example, over things we needed at SIU to appear before committees in Springfield and make our case. And all of that was, for me, a political scientist, particularly interesting, and I was glad to get to do it.
Now, you talk about, working in the interest of the university and having to work into the system of government. And I promise you I'm getting to a point here along the way. There are many different ways that folks can exert power. One of those things being, of course, media, right? We're sitting here right now having a communication.
Exactly.
Right now that'll be a distributed piece of tangible media that, who knows what influence it'll have over somebody, but hopefully somebody will just watch it and enjoy it. Just one of the best parts about when you came in the building and Kevin Purcell being like, oh, I still hear you on this and I see you on that. It's so exciting. Is there a particular place where the understanding of media, the power of media, the ethics behind media, all kind of wrapped together for you, a place where it started, a place where it's gone, and kind of where it's ended up now with something like you had mentioned being a rotating guest on the panel for Capitol View?
Yeah, I've been fascinated by the media and have studied it. The influence of the media on politics has really been one of the things that I've followed carefully. I had a good friend here named Keith Sanders who was into national circles on what's called political communications. And I've always studied that because it's a profound symbiotic relationship between the two. I always had great regard for the journalist and for the TV and radio and news people that I have dealt with over the years, and have done lots and lots of interviews on television, radio, and newspapers over the years. And I think we've gotten to such a complex media world now, it's hard for anybody to unravel it all. But the long and short is a free media is absolutely essential for a democracy. The founders understood that and enshrined the First Amendment freedoms around that concept. But that's also a part of civic education, and I see myself as in civic education. I see the media as in civic education. And so I've always been very interested in that, very respectful of the role that the reporters play that come to interview me. And frankly, some of them are pretty young. I mean, if you do River Region report out at the SIU TV station with those young people, you have to give them a foundation in what we're about to talk about. And so that's a part of the teaching function. But it's all been part and parcel of the same educational role, it seems to me.
That's good, and it's healthy. I mean, it needs to be the capacity for media literacy and to just navigate this ever as I think you said it best, complex world. Is that something where you and Paul connected well?
Yeah, he was a journalist, of course, and both owned and edited newspapers, and that was his background starting when he was 19 years old. So yeah, we had similar views on that from the get-go. He wasn't really into the academic side of the formal study of the role of mass media. That wasn't. He was just such a good practitioner and understood both sides of having been a journalist and then having gone into politics. So he also respected what journalists did and always was careful to treat those people right.
It's amazing anytime I see somebody who ought to be better to journalists not being good to journalists. It blows my mind. Like, you don't understand that these folks are literally who put your message in front of others, and you either are going to work with them or you're not. And the product on the other end is going to validate what you were willing to put into that.
Yeah, exactly. And again, the authoritarian systems use the media and abuse the media in their systems, and we have to keep holding out the free media standard.
And that's I talked to Jack Titchener a little bit about this in his episode 24 of the WTF Carbondale podcast. I think I've got that right. Shameless plug in the midst, but talking about something like the fairness doctrine going away in the middle of the Reagan administration and its impact on, this, I'll call it a mess of what we're in the midst of now. Yeah,
right, exactly. It may well have gone off the rails right about there.
Is there any particular interview or activity or something early on in your career that kind of sticks out as just a unique media interaction that you had, or something that's just very memorable to you?
Well, my early days here, I started fairly quickly getting asked about politics, particularly because I was American government campaigns, elections, political parties, public opinion. So
in a very good Arkansas accent.
And a good Arkansas accent, which hasn't changed that much. So I got fairly quickly connected to Channel 3, but that's not the Channel 3 that you and most people know. It was in a storefront just barely off the square in Harrisburg. I would drive over there to do 10 o'clock news on the night of the elections, and it would be one guy interviewing me, an engineering guy back in the back, and nobody else around.
Did they smoke just as much back then?
They did.
Engineering.
Yeah. And it was just it was primitive. So when Bonnie and Steve Wheeler bought out that and moved it to Carterville and built a modern operation there, it was a dramatic change. But I remember where they came from.
So what was kind of there? And that God, I should reach out to Bonnie and Steve and look to have them on and talk about that. But I mean, you watched that happen.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They were the newcomers because I'd been here 10 years maybe when they bought out the station. But you can't imagine what a transformation that was.
Yeah.
And I think Channel 3 then was probably the worst ABC network news operation in the country, and the Wheelers transformed all of that.
Well, I mean, and I've only seen a little bit about their backstory, but they came in and was Steve running the day-to-day operations, and Bonnie was the anchor?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, he was general manager, owner, and she was the anchor. But they staffed up pretty quickly.
That's a story I got to chase down. Thank you for that primer, John. I think that's
it's the advantage of being here 50 years.
Well, and I mean, this is the type of just the rooted story here that I'm looking to put parallel with the here and now, and a little bit of what the future could be. Right, being able to talk to folks like yourself that just have not just been close to the story, but have been part of the story, right? And can tell it from your perspective, but that perspective connects to so many other folks out there. And there's still plenty of folks that exist in space that, that have their own particular. I had Emil Spies on the podcast a couple of podcasts ago. I mean, just there are folks that still have, this complete, bucket of memories that people need to see and be shared in kind of this, casual, modern context. And
we tried to tell that story in that 150th anniversary book we put out, which I edited and wrote the first and last chapter. So shameless promotion here.
No, please plug it away.
It really does. That book attempts to show that transition and what we've been through, with emphasis on the last 50 years. And so I think it succinctly captures that era and that growth era that we were talking about earlier, and how we went through that transition and how we got to where we are today. And people like Emil, of course, were critical parts. There was a generation of the Morris era on through to my era that really saw all that transition. And again, that story is also Carbondale's story.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and this is the perfect segue. That's what I love about these conversations. I'm the type. I have a mind for just watching conversations play out. Right. Some people rush through and they want an answer from you. Sometimes you just have a conversation and this all wraps around. This gets back to what I wanted to reference earlier in the conversation before I asked you about how you got into politics. And that is kind of the work that was done through the university to reach out to all of the communities surrounding Carbondale and throughout Southern Illinois to take the enrichment that the university offered to the people that attended the university and distribute that throughout the region.
Yeah.
And just being having a front row seat to that activity.
Yeah, that has changed dramatically. In the Morris era, there was so much money and so much available that he could work with. He had a huge department called the Department of Community Development. Mm-hmm. They had field people that went out and worked with the towns and the cities in the area and tried to help them get grants to get water and sewer systems and all kinds of technical help. And it was kind of like the Department of Agriculture, the county agents going out and helping the farmers. And about the second budgetary crisis after Delight Morris came along was so-called firing of the 106 and 37 tenured faculty were let go to accommodate some new budget realities during the Ogilvy years. And that whole group got disbanded and most of them fired. And so the ability to subsidize that level of go-out changed dramatically. We went from just huge enterprise to almost nothing.
Yeah.
So we've had to slowly rebuild the outreach in ways that the state will support because the state basically didn't care that we didn't keep doing that. And so we've had to reinvent that. We still do great work on things like ag, for example, or medical school outreach and all kinds of other technical outreach. WSIU is a great function of outreach to the area and across much of the state. So we've got to have the 21st century of that, and we're still struggling to define all of that.
Well, so at least knowing that that's something that you have to find, right? I'm sure there are plenty of places where people don't even know what they need to find.
Yeah, right.
And we've at least highlighted that much.
Yeah.
That's a little bit more reassuring than some people might think.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we still think we have a regional obligation, but funding it and keeping it going and defining what it means in terms of jobs and economic development and enrichment of the culture and providing health care and all of those things is very much a work in progress.
Well, and what can be, this ties back to what we were talking about earlier, what can be funded as work and what just is purely service.
Yeah,
and
exactly. There is a lot of that, but not as much as perhaps there should be.
Well, and I think the other side is just hiring in folks. I had another person on the podcast. Now I'm going to hate myself for not being able to remember which episode Camille was. Maybe it was 58, give or take. But Camille Davidson, the new dean of the law school.
Okay.
And she had talked about a commitment to service in the region and what that looks like through the School of Law. And I think if you've got just a handful more of folks, that have the same mindset like herself in the right places throughout the university, that transformation just very well may be, not only plausible but underway as we speak.
Yeah, well, their law clinic over there has done that well, getting students involved and trying to help people with particularly the elderly, help them with their legal affairs. That is really important, and they've been doing that pretty well for a long time.
Yeah.
And I'm sure she's committed to that.
No, I think that's healthy stuff. Where am I? Okay, cool. Double checking my time. I still sometimes I worry when I get into these conversations, and sometimes the time flies by. Sometimes the time paces out just right, and I was like, man, we've had such a good conversation so far. Am I going to be lost here for time? But we still got all the time in the world, John. So you were talking about, what part of our conversation came of the idea to have folks from the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute on the podcast, and just do a little bit of a series here.
Good.
That's kind of how I've hoped to transform this piece of media that I'm creating, but also I think that provides greater lift to an organization as a whole if I have a multitude of guests on sequentially or near one another that can provide insight into an organization from their own particular standpoint. Yours is unique in the fact that you've kind of got that day one view of the institution. Can you kind of walk me through the story as a whole?
Of the Paul Simon
Yeah.
Institute? Yeah, well, Paul, of course, served 2 terms in the Senate, 5 terms in the House. He represented this district in the House first. And then in 1984, he beat Chuck Percy and got to be senator, and thus the whole state was his responsibility. But he always had a special feel for this area and had built a home in Makanda by that time. It really had become home. So all the time he was in Senate, he and Gene would come back here when the session was out, and when they needed a base, of course. I think they sometimes had an apartment in Chicago, but most of the time was here.
Mm-hmm.
So when he decided to retire, I had hoped, and others had hoped, that he might come back here, and he evidenced some interest in that, but he also had lots of other offers,
Mm-hmm.
many of them in Champaign, Chicago, and Washington.
Really? Okay.
So there was another dean named Joe Foote, who was Dean of Communications at
Mm-hmm.
the time. Joe and I got the idea that we should put together a proposal, and we both had been friends with Paul. In fact, I'd done some of his surveys and knew him way back when he first moved to town and ran, and that would have been 73 for the 74 election.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd been close with him. So Joe and I put together this proposal, and we started courting Paul and Gene,
Mm-hmm.
because Gene was certainly very much a part of the package.
Yeah.
She was chair of the National Library Board at that time for the federal government, so she had a big responsibility
Mm-hmm.
in Washington. They had one child in Washington and one here, Sheila at the time. Sheila and Perry were here, of course, then. And we had some advantages, but Washington, Chicago, Champaign had some advantages. So
Mm-hmm.
The board got behind this. The president of the university at that time thought it was a great idea and was very supportive, a guy named Ted Sanders. So we worked it through the internal machinations first, faculty senate, graduate council, all the other constituency groups had to get on board. And anyway, we finally made Paul and Gene an offer. They accepted it, and we started the wheels turning. He came here on about January the 15th of, he left the Senate really in 96, but he served about 20 days of 97 and immediately came to SIU and set up shop. We chose that site over there in the forestry building, and we've been there ever since. And I've now gone through 5 or 6 directors with the Institute. But of course, Paul was here 7 years, which was a major advantage. I had a friend who was a political scientist that was head of the Robert Dole Institute out at the University of Kansas. And I talked to him about what we were doing. He said, "Man, you got a huge advantage." He says, "I see Robert Dole about once or twice a year because he lives in Washington.
Yeah.
You got Paul Simon right there."
Uh-huh.
So that's the way it was, and it's worked out beautifully.
That's funny. Yeah, that the namesake of the Institute being a tangible figure in
And
places.
teaching classes and all of that good stuff.
Well, who did I see? Oh, I think Will Stevens did an interview with somebody at some point in the last couple weeks, and And there was, oh well, no, he did the mayor
right.
series.
Yeah,
Which hello,
exactly.
come on, Nathan, and got to talk about
Yeah, he
having
did.
Paul as
Yeah,
a
and what an impact it had that he could. Yeah, I thought he did well on that discussion of his and Paul's relationship.
well, I bet.
There are lots and lots of people who have Paul Simon stories, let me tell you.
Well, and that's just that speaks to that's what you're supposed to have. If you're in politics like that, and it doesn't matter if you're the elected official, if you're the chief of staff, if you're just somebody working the phones at the front desk in an office, or you're just somebody on it, you're supposed to have stories, right? Because that's those stories underpin that policy.
Yeah, and Paul's were often great stories. He was a character with lots of sort of special quirks. He loved Pepsi Cola, which Harry Crisp over at Marion loved the fact that he loved Pepsi Colas, but he was really a big fan of Pepsi Cola. And one night I was driving him from White County, Carmi, where we'd been up there to a meeting until about 10 o'clock, and we were coming down to a little crossroads where there was a filling station and a couple of other buildings behind it. He said, pull over into that filling. I said, Paul, it's closed. He said, I don't care, pull over in there. So he said, pull around here to the side. I pulled around, and there was a Pepsi machine. He got out and fed quarters into the Pepsi machine, 10 o'clock at night, and he knew in the dark at a crossroads where the Pepsi machine was. So that was Paul Simon with one of his weaknesses.
That's funny. That's good. Was that Harry L. Crisp number one or Harry L. Crisp the second?
Well, actually Harry Crisp the second was the guy then. His son was Lee, which is kind of the third.
Yep.
But Harry L. the second was the guy that I was talking about, and he used to love. He and Paul were great friends, and he'd love Paul giving Pepsi.
That's awfully funny for a guy of Harry L.'s persuasion.
Yes, it is, because they were not always on the same political.
Well, it cracks me up. I've got just a little bit of personal reference on this one too, John. Pepsi fired me because I would say that they didn't like my politics, whatever else. That's fine. Neither here nor there. But in the time that I got to spend at Pepsi, 4 months I was a marketing person there, and I set up in the John Brown vending building in the back corner of this office next to what was this wide open glass walled office that was an executive space for
suite.
Suite, exactly, right. So when Harry L. came back from Florida this would have been maybe July, August-ish of 2020, maybe a little bit before then. But he came back and he plopped himself right down in that office for a handful of months on a regular basis. I got to see everybody go in and have an interaction with Harry L. And it's funny to have just gotten just enough nearness of some of this activity to have a little bit of context to know exactly what a conversation between Harry L. Crisp and Paul Simon just might have looked like.
Well, I actually got to go to a couple of dinner parties out at Paul's house in Macanda with Harry L. and Rosemary, and I saw that up close and personal. But they were great friends and mutual admirers, even though they had some serious political differences.
I would say that's an understatement. Well, that's a level of civility that.
Yeah, they had that level. They really did.
Yeah, well, that's what That's what we're missing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. That's
what they say has gone wrong with the Senate and the House, especially because those people used to fight like crazy on the floor, and then they would go out to dinner at night, and they had friendships. They don't have much of that anymore.
Yeah.
It's become blood sport.
And it is a shame because the friendship component of politics tied into a disagreement about policy is where effective government exists.
Yeah, and it took some of the roughest and most brutal edges out of it and allowed them often to find a workable solution and public policy that could pass. The news tonight looks like there's going to be an infrastructure bill. that was normal legislating up until about 1994 when Newt Gingrich took over as the speaker.
Do you see Newt Gingrich as like the kind of
that was one of the major breaking points right there. It really started with Reagan, but it got much, much more vicious with Newt Gingrich and the 94 takeover of the House and the reward for that brand of politics, which has continued and multiplied today.
Do you have any particular advice that you think is an antidote to those set of politics that were fired up in that era?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
And if not, it's okay. Don't feel like, because there are some things we just don't have answers for. And if that's one of them, that's one of them.
My answer is kind of something I talked about earlier. That is, we've got to do a better job with civic education and the need for these kinds of public dialogues, and the idea that you stay within some boundaries and that there are norms and that there are guardrails and that they all exist in a democracy. Otherwise, you get chaos, and we've been teetering on chaos. The January the 6th example of that chaos is what you get, and there's got to be enough people step back in some horror of that. And if you listen to those Capitol Police who testified, that shows you what you can get inside the Capitol that's not happened since 1812. And reasonable people have to draw back in some horror from that level of vituperation and embracing of violence and embracing of reducing other people to the other, to be hated and feared. And we don't have enough conversation about that, and the failure of civic education that I talked about earlier is a part of that. And we in public education haven't done a good enough job. The media haven't done enough to be able to get that message across.
Well, in just the difference in the way that media is presented as a whole. I mean, the way that something like January 6th would have been covered in 1976 versus the way that it's seen now. The visuals of a few black and white photos and some text and a little bit of, glancing media on the television that you can only see in the moment that it's there on screen but nowhere else, versus the mass of media that surrounds an event like this now that is almost difficult to digest for some people.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got a ways to go on that. I think we're making progress, and some days I'm more encouraged than others. I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to come through this transition and lower the temperature just a bit, which is what we need to do.
No, I think it's...
But, and I've put in a plug for facts rather than ignorance and conspiracy theories and nonsense that passes for stuff that people believe. We got way too much of that going on.
Do you see that evident in the student body that you engage with now?
Yeah, you get all kinds. We're a big slice of what's coming out of Illinois high school, so we get all kinds.
Is it pretty significantly different than what it was many years ago?
That's a good question. I think the major difference to me is a lack of interest in international foreign policy, defense policy, because my students in 69, 70, 71, 72, the males particularly, were under the gun of the draft, and they knew about the Vietnam War and what it meant to them very personally. We don't have that today with the all-volunteer Army. So I think that's the major change. I think, too, people are more vocationally oriented now than they were then. A lot of kids then weren't worried about a union card or what they were going to do, probably sometimes very naively, but nevertheless, I think this is a much more practical when can I get a job and what does this mean for that paycheck?
Yeah.
And there are goods and bads to that.
Well, and I can see the other side. I mean, I lucked out simply growing up in Carbondale. College to me was just kind of that thing that you did because it was there. So I got to use it to enjoy myself and enrich myself a little bit and not have to focus on what a lot of folks have to go to school for, which is how do I go to school, get this degree, go get a job on the other side.
Yeah.
So I can see where that transition would occur from one set of interest to the other.
What I used to tell students, and again, Dean of Liberal Arts for 12 years, you can imagine I would do this, but I tell them it's not an either-or proposition. You can learn something that's going to be useful to you, get you that first job, get you to graduate school, professional school, law school, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you need to learn what it means to be a good citizen, a good person, a contributing member of society, and what those values are that make us more human. We've always had a strong theater program, a strong music program, all kinds of humanities, art program, for example. Those are the enrichment things that you're supposed to get from a university education. And so they can easily go hand to hand, but you have to work at it.
John, I always look for just kind of this little, really nice kind of end point from folks. Sometimes it's perfect. Sometimes I work for it a little bit, and that was it. That was the perfect
That's it. Okay. Well, yeah, that is kind of a valedictorian speech.
and I do hope that you've been able to learn just a little bit more from this conversation
Absolutely.
episode.
Well, you're plugged in and I'm not, so certainly I know you're the sort of nerve center of a big part of the culture of certainly Central Carbondale and all this region. So I appreciate that. I don't have your access, and I'm not out there circulating the way you are.
Well, you definitely still have a particular style of access, and your. Sorry, I'm over on my other switch here. Your influence, not just standalone, but again as part of this system of folks, right? Your ability to rub off on people. I told this to somebody that I was discussing. My platforms with a couple weeks back that had some grievances to air with me. I was like, listen, I can't have influence over things if I'm not close to them, for good or for bad, right? And I simply leverage a digital space to do that. I happen to also exist very prevalently in a physical space, but the map for something like that has been laid out by folks like yourself.
Well, thank you.
And I appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate being asked to come down. I used to come in here and watch movies, and I can't tell you how many times I brought my kids here. I saw Star Wars here. So.
Well, and that's another really cool part just about this function overall, and why producing this particular media in this particular space is important, because this building is where memories exist.
Oh yeah, absolutely. For families like mine, our kids grew up here, so. We lived over on Swartz, right next to Winkler School.
Did you guys used to walk down here?
Oh yeah, we walked down here for Halloween when Halloween was a thing for families.
Yeah.
We walked down here for all kinds of things. My kids walked all the way over to Lincoln, which is now the police station, because we lived close enough on Swartz.
How old are your kids now?
My kids are.
Ballpark. Give me ballpark. I'm just trying to see where they line up with if you happen to be around the same. If they would have been around my parents' age, if you're around my grandfather's age, if there's any connection on the back end there.
Yeah, my kids are now 50 and 52.
Okay, all right. And so they're a little bit younger.
Yeah, they went to Winkler School and Lewis School, and then they went over. To Thomas School. My wife taught in the Carbondale public school system for a long time, so she knew all kinds of kids. And then they both of them went to the U of I to get away from me, basically. I said, you could actually go to, yeah, everybody knows you. We're trying to get out of here.
It's like having your dad be principal of the school in a very adult way.
Yeah, they thought I was too much to be around. They just wanted to go somewhere else because of that. But they had a great education and great upbringing in Carbondale.
Well, and that is part of it. And I don't think we've had too much of this man here by any stretch of the imagination. Episode 78 of the WTF Carbondale podcast, John Jackson. And as I always say, folks, have a good one, whatever that one may be.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course.